Hello everybody, my name is Jeff Clune and I'm currently a postdoc in Hod Lipson's lab here at Cornell, and starting in January I will be an assistant professor at the University of Wyoming. And I quickly want to begin by acknowledging some of the great minds that have helped me with this research, who you can see here. I also want to thank the NSF for a postdoctoral fellowship that allowed me to come here and do this work. Before I begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'm not going to tell you about today, which is some of the other work that I've done. And the reason I want to mention this is in case any of you are interested in these topics, you can come talk to me about them at any point. You can email me or chat after class. And that is on the evolution of evolvability, wherein evolution speeds itself up and learns how to do that. The evolution of altruism, so you can get robots that are playing nice with each other and learn how that happens in nature. And also interactions between evolution and development, when an organism is kind of unfurling from a single-celled organism and how that impacts the way that they evolve. But what I am here to talk to you about today is how to evolve artificially intelligent robots. Now when I mention that, many of you probably think about robots like these, but I'm actually talking about robots like these. So I think there's no reason why human engineers cannot rival or beat what natural selection has produced. Evolution has produced these amazing engineering marvels, such as jaguars, hawks, and humans, and the question is, why don't we produce those when we run evolutionary algorithms? And that kind of raises the question of, can we create evolutionary processes inside of computers that can produce these sorts of marvels in terms of creatures that are smart and agile? So there's two reasons I'm interested in those goals. The first one is actually a biological motivation, and that is that if you try to build something, you frequently understand it at a significant depth. Oftentimes when you're trying to do something, you say, oh, that sounds easy, and then you sit down to do it, and you realize there's all sorts of assumptions you forgot about, or things that you didn't realize you to kind of pre-think through. So by building things, you understand them. The second motivation probably appeals to a lot of people in this room, and that is engineering applications. If we can produce robots that have at this level of sophistication, obviously there'll be tremendous benefits from society, and we can use those same algorithms to evolve all sorts of different and impressive engineering solutions. So the question is, as I mentioned earlier, we've been running evolutionary algorithms now since the 1970s, roughly. Why don't we get jaguars, hawks, and human? What are the missing ingredients in our algorithms that prevent evolution from automatically generating natural levels of complexity? And I'm going to talk to you today about two principles that I think are absolutely critical in evolutionary algorithms. The first one is regularity, and the second one is modularity. And if we can get these two principles into our algorithm, I think that we will kind of level up the ability to generate complexity. So here's the overall game plan for the talk. I'm going to produce a fair amount of background. I know that some of you know about some of these topics, but maybe not all of you. And then I'm going to basically have a talk in two parts. The first part of the talk is going to be on regularity. It's a bit longer. And then there's going to be a second part of the talk on modularity. Okay, so everyone in this class knows about evolutionary algorithms and how they work. You typically you encode a certain problem. And to do that, for example, if you wanted to encode a table, you could specify the length of each leg separately and the width and the length of the surface of the table, for example. And then to generate a population, you just fill these up with random numbers. And you produce different numbers to produce different tables. You then, of course, score the population. For example, maybe you put it in a simulator, you put a big can of beer on it, and you see how long it takes for the beer to fall over. That might be your fitness function. Based on who scores well, you pick the parents. You take the genomes of the parents, and you slightly mutate a couple elements of those parents to produce offspring that are similar, but a little bit different from the ones that previously performed well. And then you just cycle that until you get a table that holds your drink. All right? That's what we've all seen probably so far in the course. What I'm going to talk to you about today is this piece of the puzzle. How do you encode a problem such that you can generate important and meaningful diversity throughout your search? What I'm going to try to convince you is that encoding makes a huge difference in terms of the success of what you get out of your algorithm. So, to be a little bit more clear, when I talk about an encoding, I mean how you represent the information of your phenotype in the genome and the process by which you take that information and you produce the final phenotype. So it's both the genome and the process. Now, there's two large classes of encodings: direct encodings and generative encodings. And I've already given you an example of a direct encoding. If I wanted to evolve this table here, I could specify the length of each leg separately. And what that means, and what happens in direct encoding, is that every separate piece of the genome is encoding for a different separate piece of the phenotype. It's separate information. Right? Now think about what happens to this table here. If you mutate this table, what's going to happen? That's right. What he's doing with his hands here is showing you that most of the tables that you get are going to spill your drink immediately, because you're going to produce irregular, uneven tables as you mutate these legs separately. Now, imagine if you have a bunch of hobbits and you want to evolve a table for them. It's very difficult to go from this normal table to this shorter table, because the intermediate steps to get there all involve crossing what's known as a fitness valley, because all of the tables have low fitness. So selection, or variation, is producing these tables, but selection is constantly pulling you back to these tables, making it very difficult, if not impossible, or extremely unlikely, to get to this table here. So the other type of encoding, the other extreme, is a generative encoding. And that's when you take information in the genome and you reuse that same information in multiple parts of the phenotype. So a very trivial example is that I take the length of a leg, specify it once, and then copy that out 4 times. So now what's going to happen when I mutate this table with this representation? We need your hand motions again. Basically, all of the tables are going to be regular, right? They're all going to have the same length. It's trivial. We've built it into the encoding. And so it allows you to get from this table to this table. But also note, it makes this table impossible. So there are trade-offs here between when you start having regularity in your genotype. So the reason I'm interested in generative encodings is because they get you a bunch of the properties that we see in the natural world that I think are very powerful. The first one is regularity. And what that basically means is repeating code and a repeating pattern. So if you look, all the fingers in your hand share basically the same code, right? It's like a little software module that's been called with a parameter, which maybe is the size of the module and some other facets. And so you want regularity, which is the repeating of a theme with and without some variation. You also get the coordinated mutational effects that we just saw in the table, and you get scalability, right? You can code you have a very small genome that can expand up to a huge phenotype. Does anybody have any idea how many neurons are in your brain, roughly?
A billion?
100 billion, but it's about the right order of magnitude, close. And how many genes are in the genome? Any guesses? It's about 25,000, give or take 5,000. So you're talking about something on the order of tens of thousands scaling up to the order of billions, and that's the kind of scalability we want in an evolutionary algorithm. You're not simply going to separately encode the trillions of connections between the billions of neurons in your brain. Okay, so to define regularity a little bit more precisely, it's the reuse of information. So for example, if I have left-right symmetry, that's a great example of regularity. I can take the information from the left side of the image and I can just reflect it, and that will therefore produce the other half of the image, which makes regularity kind of related to compressibility. So if I can compress something, it means that there is regularity in the structure. All right. This is an example, if you ask a biologist, of an irregular creature in nature. And obviously its claws are very different, right? There's some extra information in the genome that makes one claw bigger or different from the other claw. But what strikes me is that when I look at this creature, I don't see an example of irregularity. I see an example of mostly regularity, right? It's left-right symmetrical, with the exception of that claw. It's got this repeating theme for each leg. Each leg itself is a little chunk that's kind of the same basic idea repeated. And the whole thing is comprised of cells. Each cell is very similar to other cells. So this is kind of, biologists are so used to seeing regularity in the world that they almost kind of look at this and see that it's irregular because they're just kind of the proverbial fish in the sea that can't see the water. They're surrounded by it on all sides. But if you evolve things in evolutionary algorithms, you see things mostly irregular, and the question is, how do we get here? You don't, for example, see these kind of creatures in nature, or other examples, things that are totally wild and irregular and kind of crazy. All right, now, that's regularity in the phenotype, but there's also regularity out there in the world that can be seen and exploited. So we all know that in tic-tac-toe, if you discover a row that works on the row, that's also going to work on the column. And if you discover a technique that's going to work on the diagonals, it'll work for both of them. And the same goes for the edges. So the world is regular, and we want our algorithms to see that regularity and take advantage of it. Okay, my colleague Greg Hornby at NASA actually did evolve tables with generative and direct encodings, and that's why I use that as an example. And here are the final results. So here he's evolving a table, and the goal is to have it stand up and hold your drink, basically be stable, and not have a lot of volume underneath the table, so be kind of cheap to build. And if you use a direct encoding, which is probably what you guys have been using in this class, then this is what you get. These irregular tables that I'm definitely not putting a fancy beer on top of in the real world. However, if you use a generative encoding, then you get these tables. And already you can see there's left-right symmetry, there's repeated modules, such as here, and they're repeated in different areas, so it's repetition with some variation. And they look like IKEA tables. They look like they're engineered, and that's because obviously engineers also use the principle of regularity in their design. So before I started doing research on this topic, and this is actually my dissertation, we knew if this is regularity on one axis and this is fitness on another axis, we knew that if you make a very regular problem, such as evolving tables, your fitness with a generative encoding is going to be very high. But what we didn't know is what happens in the middle here. Real-world problems aren't perfectly regular. So the question is, how do these algorithms handle real situations, like the problems you might want to solve with an evolutionary algorithm? And we didn't know if this was the case, such as that once there's a little irregularity, it would just fall on its face and not perform well. Or if it would basically handle intermediate amounts of regularity, such that as regularity increased, it would exploit that intermediate regularity and therefore do better than direct encodings. And this is the question, which of these two is right, that we're going to look at in the first part of this talk. And just so you know, so you can look up the details later, all of this work is featured in a paper that I have in the Transactions on Evolutionary Computation, IEEE. And the general game plan is we're going to look at a generative encoding versus a direct encoding, and then we're going to scale the regularity of 3 separate problems and compare the two to see how they perform. Now the reason, the generative encoding I'm going to use is HyperNEAT, and the reason I chose it is one, because it has a really clean direct encoding control, which made the science fair for comparing direct versus generative, but also because I think that this algorithm is extremely powerful and interesting and is the way forward for the entire field of evolutionary algorithms. And so I think it's worth to study in its own right and to share with you its capabilities, because I think it's got a long way to go in terms of helping us kind of accelerate progress in our field. It has a Midas touch in a certain sense, that everything we apply it to seems to turn to gold and work much better. So HyperNEAT is based on a powerful idea from developmental biology, and that is how developing cells produce things like you or blue whales or hawks. If you think about it, every cell in your body runs the exact same software, right? Every cell is running the same code, same DNA, but yet you have skin cells and eye cells and liver cells and spleen cells. How does every cell know what type of cell to become? Same code turns into an eye or a liver depending on where it is. And if you read developmental biology, what they've basically figured out at a very abstract level is that cells are trying to figure out where they are located geometrically in your body, like the XYZ axis shown here. And based on their geometric location, that is what determines their type or their fate in the language of developmental biology. So it's almost as if every cell wants its XYZ coordinates, but in nature you can't just query some satellite to tell you your GPS locations. So the way that nature does it, and this is a picture of an embryo here, is it puts down geometric patterns in chemical gradients. And those chemicals tell the cells where they are situated geometrically. So this is, for example, a gradient that could have been put down by the mother in this fruit fly embryo. There's a blue to red gradient. And based on the ratio of the blue chemical to the red chemical, you can figure out where you are on this x-axis, right? And in the same embryo is a different chemical that tells you whether or not you're in an even segment or an odd segment based on if you see the green chemical. So in a certain embryo are going to be all these different chemicals that exist that tell you kind of where you are. And then the genome, the developing genome, actually takes pre-existing chemicals and combines them to produce new chemicals that specify new positions. So here's an example of a cartoon drawn up by developmental biologist Sean Carroll, and it illustrates the concept really well. This is the same embryo. These are 3 different chemicals that genes can listen to. And basically this gene here is going to say, locally, if I sense chemical A and I don't sense chemical B and C, then turn on. And the only place in the genome where that is true are these squares here. So the gene is taking pre-existing geometric patterns and combining them to produce a new, more complex pattern. And then these squares here could signal other genes to make vertebra. So you can get the repeating vertebra segments, or they could be used in downstream signaling, or both. So the gene is effectively mixing and matching these geometric patterns to produce the complexity in a final organism. So for example, these are the famous Hox genes, if you've heard of them, and they basically figure out what segment should happen based on some of these geometric clues. And these are pictures of developing Drosophila embryo. And what you can see is all these amazing geometric patterns. So for example, if you wanted to produce spots on the periphery, you could take this spotted pattern here, combine it with this pattern which is only on the periphery, and then I get spots on the periphery. And these geometric patterns are the lingua franca of developmental biology. It's how things get built in the world. So how can we steal that secret ingredient from nature and get it into our evolutionary algorithm? We're going to do that with an encoding called the compositional pattern producing network. It was invented by Kenneth Stanley down at the University of Central Florida, and it's under the hood of HyperNEAT. So it's what we want to use. And the same idea applies. It's going to encode phenotypic information as a function of geometric location. So imagine if we wanted to make a picture, a two-dimensional picture. What I need to know is what is the value, for example, the grayscale value of each pixel on the canvas. So I can basically ask the genome what should happen at each Cartesian coordinate. So each pixel, for example, this one's 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, etc. I can literally put those numbers into the genome. And this is a math function here, and based on those input numbers, it calculates some output number, and that can be my grayscale value. Make sense? So I iteratively ask the genome what should happen at each mathematical coordination. Now, if I do that with a random genome, such as this one here, I might get this random pattern. But if I do it with a network of math functions that have some of the properties I'm interested in, such as left-right symmetry or repeating theme, then I can get those properties in my phenotype. So, as in an insect, if you want left-right symmetry, you could start off with a Gaussian of the x-axis, right? And if I wanted a repeating theme, such as the segments of a millipede, then I could have a sine of the y-axis. And then I can mix and match these signals to create asymmetries, symmetries, and repetition within modules. So, to test this idea, Ken Stanley created a website called PicBreeder, where you can basically say, I like this picture, I don't like that picture. And with this encoding, here is what popped out. And when I saw this, I dropped everything I was working on as a PhD student and switched my dissertation to work with CPPNs. Because for the first time in my life, I was seeing evolutionary algorithms produce something that looked as complex as a natural creature. There's no Pixar or engineer behind this eye. This is evolved by an evolutionary algorithm. So from the back of the room, this might look like an insect, like a butterfly. And this right here is a lineage. So this intermediate generation is not shown, but this basically shows you can get graded mutational change from one functional form to another functional form. It's not like when you mutate these things, you just get scrambled garbage. The mutations themselves are sensible, just as you see in the natural world, and that's what we want. Now, to give you a sense of what came before this encoding, because you might say, oh, a human was in the loop, it's the human that causes these things to work out well. This is a generative encoding, but not one based on developmental biology. And there are a few different ones. This is Dawkins' biomorphs. This is Carl Sims' famous work in 1994. And this is great work by Hornby and Pollock that was done in a virtual world. And what you can see is there is regularity. There are repeated modules, but it's almost like Lego brick regularity. It's kind of like you get the same thing over and over again. Maybe you recursively make it smaller. You don't get the graded nuance and complexity that you see in these natural forms here. So CPPNs can allow you to have a much more kind of nuanced, natural-looking complexity. However, many people, when I showed this to developmental biologists, a lot of them were not yet convinced because they said, you're working in 2D, we want to see things in 3D. So when I showed up here, Hod and I agreed that we would basically see what happens with CPPNs in 3D, and within hours of having a code written, these things started popping out on my screen as I was just playing and evolving objects on my screen. And what you can see here are amazing properties in these three-dimensional shapes. So here I was selecting for a skull, and you can see something that looks like it has an eyes and a mouth. This might look like a female torso. You see things that look like engineered objects. And the things that really blew me away are these four guys here, because these four guys are relatives of each other. So for example, if you take this elephant here and you mutate it, sometimes you get thicker trunks, sometimes you get longer tusks, sometimes you get bigger and smaller ears. And this right here is a cousin that's got some sort of like a horn thing going on in its tusk. And here, this was my favorite, these two are cousins. They're voxel by voxel, they don't look anything alike. But they still both look like elephants because they have eyes, they have a trunk, etc. So what that means is that evolution has effectively parameterized what it means to be an elephant. You have to have a trunk, you have to have ears, or eyes, whatever, and then you can change the relative sizes of those things to produce variation. So it has figured out that humans, in this case me, I wanted things that looked elephant-like, and it kind of figured out how to produce those core patterns. So I then wanted to see what would happen if I wasn't the only one doing selection, so I threw it out on the internet for anybody to play with. We built this website called Endless Forms, and anybody can come along and do interactive evolution, and here's what it looks like. You click on a pre-existing evolved object, and you say, I like this one, for example, click evolve, you get some new designs. In this case, I see one that looks shaggy, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I click on that lamp, and I get more variants on the shaggy lamp concept, and then I can publish it for other people to further evolve. So it's not the case that everyone has to start from scratch. And then if you look at what we came up with, you see we get things that have repetition with variation. You see we have objects that have left-right symmetry, radial symmetry, etc. And the most important thing is that they look natural. The encoding is producing faces and butterflies and mushrooms, things that look like they're from the natural world. And so it's an indication that we're on track to capture some of the power of developmental biology and get it into our algorithms. Of course, we have 3D printers now, so people can also use this technology to make toys and chess sets and things for themselves. And you can see some examples here. And we had a lot of help, and this generated a lot of interest. So far, I think 3.3 million objects have been evaluated by humans from all over the world, and there's been a lot of education benefits. People are actually using this in the classroom to teach young students how evolution works and how you can go from a random start and a simple object to something very complex using evolution and see the entire chain of intermediate steps. All right, but I'm also interested in artificial intelligence, not just evolving chess sets. So what's cool is that this exact same encoding can help you evolve neural networks. And I believe Sebastian talked to you last week about what neural networks are. Very briefly, we take the entire complexity of the brain and we boil it down to just neurons and connections between neurons. And basically this is an abstract representation of how your brain computes things like poetry and how to play Space Invaders. And the general idea is that some of these connections are inhibitory, some are excitatory, and the patterns, which neuron connects to which neuron, and the strength of those interactions determines the computation performed by your brain or this brain. And so what we're going to ask the CPPN to do is to produce to tell us what should the connection weights be between each neuron in the brain. So the way that we do that is I have this connection here. I need to situate it in geometric space to take advantage of this concept. So this neuron here has the from node has Cartesian coordinates, maybe 2, 0. And the to node I can also give Cartesian coordinates. In this case, it's also 2, 0. I pass these numbers into this genome, and this genome will do some math, and it will spit out a value for that connection. If I want multiple layers, I can have multiple outputs. And then what I do is I say, okay, thanks for the information for this node. How about 2, 0 to 1, 0? How about 2, 0 to 3, 0? I iteratively go through and I ask the genome what every single connection in the brain should be based on the geometric coordinates of those nodes. And it's effectively, instead of painting two-dimensional pictures, it's painting link weight patterns in this neural tissue, right? And then what we're going to look at experimentally is whether or not it creates A, regular patterns, and B, whether or not that helps it exploit regularity out there in the world to solve regular problems. Now, to do that comparison, I need a direct encoding to compare with. So I used an algorithm that I invented, but it's based on NEAT. It's called fixed topology NEAT. It's got the exact same neural network, same number of connections. It's just that the weights of that network are specified via a different algorithm. As opposed to the CPPN painting patterns in that neural network, now we have just a giant list of connections, and evolution can separately go in and mutate this number or this number or this number. So it's a simple direct encoding. Now, we're ready to look at some data. The first thing I'm going to show you is that it is true that a generative encoding will exploit problem regularity to outperform the direct encoding. So let's take a look at that. The first problem I invented is very trivial, but it was a diagnostic problem to see if this principle works. And I call it the target weights problem. And basically, I'm going to take a certain neural network, I'm going to randomly pick a value for each of the connections, and I'm going to tell evolution, match this target. Try to evolve the exact same neural network. And then the fitness is just how different each connection is from its target summed up. Make sense? Okay, so the most irregular version of that problem, each one of these connections is separately randomized. Picked randomly, that's orange. The most regular version of the problem is I randomly take one number, and I make all the connections that number. So it's very regular because they're all going to be the same. And then I can intermix those two, right? So this one, half of the connections are one randomly chosen number, and all the other connections are independently, each separately randomly determined. So I can skew the amount of regularity in the problem. Here's the data. First, I want to point out that the direct encoding, HyperNEAT, all of the treatments for all of the different regularities are all on top of each other. So it's blind to the regularity, and that totally makes sense. Because even if every number is the same, if I'm separately trying to mutate them, I get no benefit from the fact that they're all the same. The most regular version of the problem here, though, for HyperNEAT, it perfectly solves the problem in a few generations. In fact, the performance of the CPPN perfectly correlates with the regularity of the problem, as you can see here, which is a good first indication that HyperNEAT can A, do better on more regular versions of the problem, and B, exploit intermediate amounts of regularity, not just complete regularity. Now, this problem is too simple, though, because it has no epistasis, which is a biological term for interaction. The optimal value for one link has nothing to do with what's set at the other values. That's not how your brain works. For your brain, the optimal value for one connection depends on the other connections that it's working with. So I wanted to invent another problem that was also intuitively simple, but had a lot of these epistatic interactions. And I call that bit mirroring. And the general idea here is I have a sheet of neurons, and I'm going to pass in information on the input side, like a 1. And for each neuron, for example, this neuron here, if I pass in a 1 here, it has to produce a 1 here, where that neuron's target is. So for example, in this network here, if I pass in a 1 here, it's got to put a 1 here. That's it. Now, intuitively, that's simple, but it's actually an extremely hard problem for all learning algorithms, evolution, reinforcement learning, etc. Because think about this. Evolution has to learn to turn this connection on, but all the other connections coming out of this neuron off. And it gets very sparse signal as to whether or not it's right. For example, this neuron here, if this connection turns on and it was off, it might still not produce the right answer because there might be all sorts of masking information coming in from these other neurons to confuse it. So it's a very, very difficult problem. Did you have a quick question?
On the previous slide,
yeah.
I was wondering why, for just some partial regularities, why your algorithm would plateau out after a while.
That's a good question. It's a great question, and we're going to spend a chunk of the talk on that question. So just hold on to it for a second. It's a good observation. All right. So this problem here, I can scale the regularity by having all of the rows and the targets in the targets in the same row and column. That's the most regular version of the problem. And then I can relax the column expectation and then the row expectation to the point that by the most irregular version of the problem, all bets are off as to where this target is going to be. And then we tested both algorithms again. And here's the direct encoding. And what you can see is I scale regularity from low to high. Once again, the direct encoding is completely blind to the regularity of the problem. It does not do better. And this is what we have been doing for 40 years in using direct encodings. Most people don't use generative encodings, which means most people are not seeing the regularity of the world. The generative encoding, on the other hand, as you scale up regularity, it increasingly exploits that regularity to perform better. And if you do statistics, these guys are significantly better than these guys, and these guys are better than these guys. It basically totally exploits the regularity out there until on the most regular version of the problem, it solves it perfectly in almost every single run. All right, so that's a pretty good demonstration on two diagnostic problems. But let's try it on a more challenging engineering problem, which is evolving gates for quadruped robots. Now, typically in evolution, this problem is too hard. If you ask evolution to evolve a gate for a legged robot, it falls on its face. And that is because it does not see the regularity out there. It does not see that there are 4 legs and maybe they should do something similar. So what's happened historically, if we wanted to evolve a gate, is you evolve a neural network for 1 leg, and maybe you copy and paste it to all 4 legs. Or you evolve a network for the front 2, and you have a different one for the back 2 if you want front-back symmetry. And with this technique, evolution can outperform human engineers at producing gates. In fact, Sony, when they made the Aibo robot, came to Greg Hornby, the guy who evolved the tables, and they said, we can't get this thing to run. Can you evolve a gate? And he used this technique and was able to evolve a gate that was shipped in the first commercial distribution of the Sony robot, which is a great victory for evolution, but also a bit of a failure because he had to hand decompose the regularity. And that means that he might constrain the solution or miss important regularities that are out there. We want evolution to do this automatically. So that's what we're going to see if the CPPN can do that. So here's the actual neural net. It's got an input, a hidden, and an output layer. The input layer for each leg, I have the current angle of the 3 joints, as well as a touch sensor. And then I have a pitch, roll, and yaw of the torso, and then a sine wave, which provides a clock for repetition. And to scale the regularity, I just add noisy joints. So I increase the number of joints that have some error in them. I request an angle of 42, I get an angle of 42.9 or something. Here's the data. Once again, this is the most irregular version of the problem. As I scale up the regularity, HyperNEAT increasingly exploits the regularity to perform better. And on the more regular versions of the problem, HyperNEAT outperforms the direct encoding FTNEAT. So, I hope that I've shown you that a generative encoding can definitely exploit intermediate amounts of regularity and does better on regular problems. Now we can actually look at why. The first thing is that it produces regular behaviors. So when I downloaded this robot off of the internet, this is somebody had programmed it to work, and they used inverse kinematics, and you can see the walking behavior here, and you can see that it looks like a robot. It looks very mechanical. It doesn't look very natural. So I wanted to see what would happen with CPPNs, and in the first generations, it's a very hard problem for evolution. It's flailing around. That was generation 0. In the first generation, it learns to take 1 hop, and then it falls over. It doesn't look like it's on a very promising path. Generation 5, it's taken 2 hops, and then looks like it's doing a drunken crawl home from the bar. But after 1,000 generations, it gets better. And this is the direct encoding here. And you can see it's learned to walk, but note that each leg is kind of doing its own thing. Like I have no idea what this leg is doing up here. It's just kind of like flapping around in the breeze. It's not really helping out. The CPPN, on the other hand, produces extremely regular gaits. All 4 legs are working together. It looks more natural. It's also repeating the same basic regularity over and over again through time, making it very effective. And as we saw before, that's a much higher performing gait. If you look at the worst performing gaits, here's FTNEAT here, and you can see it's very pathological. And anyone who's ever evolved anything in simulation knows that this is what you tend to get. It's doing some matrix moves, like dodge bullets, but it's figured out how to get away from 0, but not in any sort of a coordinated, regular behavior. The worst HyperNEAT gait is not as good as the median gait, but it's still coordinated. It kind of looks like a puppy learning to walk or something, but all 4 legs are moving together, same basic pattern through time. It's still coordinated, and it looks more effective. It looks like it's on the right path to eventually learning how to run. This is an example of the best HyperNEAT gait, and what you can see is 3 legs are working together, and the other leg is working out of phase. So that's an example of regularity with variation. But most importantly, I'm going to run that again. It looks fat. It looks natural. The body is just a table, but it still kind of looks like a creature running around on the savannah. Again, a good indication that we're on the right path to capturing some of the power of nature. So those are the behaviors. How about the brains themselves? We can actually look at the neural connections in these brains. So to help you see this is the output sheet of neurons. This is the hidden layer stuck in here, and here are the outputs, or the inputs, sorry. This is from the back, and the same brain again from the front, on the top and bottom. And the right column is the direct encoding. And to me, it looks like a scrambled mess. I can't differentiate this brain from randomly generated neural connections. Just so you know, red is inhibitory and green is excitatory, and the thickness of the connection indicates the strength of the connection. So this just looks random, but look at HyperNEAT, which is produced by the CPPN. It's producing geometric pattern regularities in neural tissue. So for example, here you have inhibitory connections on top, excitatory connections on bottom, and you have those repeated for each node, right? You have a different pattern for the front than you have for the back half of the brain. And looking at the back, you can see this really complex diffusion of inhibitory connections. So it's mostly, it's a little bit of red on top, mostly green, and then that red fades away faster in this direction than this direction, and all the way up here, you see none of that. So it's kind of this complex geometric pattern. Now, different runs of the same algorithm will produce different geometric patterns, depending on the idiosyncratic path that evolution takes and the behavior it produces. So here you see left-right symmetry, here you see diagonal symmetry, repeat one node there's an exception for, or a column or an exception made for 2 columns. And one thing that's cool is that you can actually look at these brains and you can take a guess at their behavior. So many of the brains looked, I can tell one leg is different, and I would look and it's a leg where 3 of the legs are operating together and 1 leg is operating differently. So when I got here to this lab, we wanted to see if we could apply it to a real robot. So Han has this 3D printed robot sitting on the shelf, and Jason Yosinski, myself, and an undergrad, Sean Lee, decided to put HyperNEAT on this robot. Now there have been 9 papers that have published gates for this robot, and HyperNEAT ended up producing the fastest gate so far seen on this robot. So here you can see it in the physics simulator, this robot, and these are the gates that it produces. Again, coordinated and regular. And then in the world, here you can see it kind of chasing after one of the chairs in our office. I should point out that this robot is extremely weak. The servos are constantly timing out. So I'd like to see what HyperNEAT can do with a much more powerful, effective robot. But at least we do see the highest performance so far, and we see a very regular, coordinated behavior. All right, now I'm going to answer your question, which is, are we too biased towards regularity such that maybe we're missing some of the irregularity that we need to produce in these brains? So if you remember, your question was, all right, this treatment here, HyperNEAT gets 90% of the connections, which 90% of them are the same. It sees that 90%, and it does so very quickly. But then over the course of 1,000 generations, it does not make any improvements for the rest of those connections. Right? So the question is, maybe it's good at producing exploiting the regularity that's out there, but it's unable to make fine-tuned exceptions to those regular patterns to truly kind of do as well as it could do on the problem. So that led me to think about combining the best of both worlds, generative and direct encodings. And I invented an algorithm called hybrid, which stands for a hybridization of indirect and direct encodings, because indirect encoding is another name for generative encoding. And the basic idea is a generative encoding, in this case HyperNEAT, you can run for a while, and it will exploit the regularity of the problem. But if you see its performance flat, then maybe you can turn it over to direct encoding, which can take that basic pattern and start fine-tuning and making exceptions to the rule to handle any remaining fitness benefits in the problem. So at the switch point, if we see a spike in performance, then we know that the generative encoding was leaving something on the table that the direct encoding can exploit. So here is the same exact problem, target weights, with the hybrid algorithm. I've left on the old treatments, and now I'm adding in hybrid, which is gray. And what you can see is at the switch point, there's an immediate fitness improvement. In this case, error is bad. So you see, once we switch over to the direct encoding, it starts making improvements. In this case, you see it start making improvement on the progress, whereas HyperNEAT was stuck. So I tried it again on the same basic idea on bit mirroring. And I didn't even put FTNEAT on this slide since it was so bad. But black here is HyperNEAT, and red is hybrid. And in every single case, hybrid was greater than or equal to HyperNEAT. And in some cases, the difference was hugely significant. So we saw an improvement there. And we also see an improvement on the robotics problem, the quadruped gait problem. So this line here, for example, is HyperNEAT. This is what happens if you don't switch. If you do switch, you see this immediate lift in performance. And you see that for all the different regularity versions of the problem. And the size of the performance improvement roughly correlates with the irregularity of the problem. So in the more irregular versions, the direct encoding makes a larger performance improvement. So that's 3 indications that yes, generative encodings are good at exploiting regularity, but they're not silver bullets. They can't do everything. They're maybe not that good at making fine-tuned exceptions. So one solution to that problem for your own work is you could combine generative and direct, as I have done. But probably a more long-term solution for the field is combining a generative encoding with some algorithm that will fine-tune and make adjustments, but not a direct encoding. Why not a lifetime learning algorithm? So you are born with some basic instincts, some basic default wiring patterns, but then within your life, a learning algorithm is tuning and adjusting different weights within your brain to make you better in your actual situation. And that is, I think, what hybrid really points to as the future for this field. And I should say that when I initially proposed this idea in the literature, the next year, my colleague Jean-Baptiste Morin and his student implemented it, tested it, and it turned out to work. A generative encoding plus learning does improve the performance just as it did with hybrid. All right, that was part 1. That was regularity. We're now going to talk about another important principle which you're going to want in your evolutionary algorithms, and that's modularity. And here is Jean-Baptiste Morin himself. He came here 2 summers in a row to visit with me, and this paper that I'm about to tell you now is the result of last summer's visit. This is obviously also with HOD, and it's currently out there in archive, and it's being reviewed right now in a journal, so it's not even hot off the presses. It's in the press. All right, so what is modularity? It is the localization of function in an encapsulated unit. And you've seen this before. In a car, for example, you don't have one entangled engineering mess. You have separate components. You have a spark plug, a muffler, a wheel. In your body, you've got heart, spleen, liver. You don't just have this kind of gelatinous goo that does everything you need it to do. You see separated and encapsulated functions. Now, I want to point out that modularity does not equal regularity. These are different concepts. They're often confused because modules are often repeated. So for example, on a unicycle, you have one wheel. And that wheel is its own thing. It's separate from the handlebars and the brakes. If you can swap out the brakes without affecting the performance of the wheel, and vice versa. It's its own encapsulated unit, but there's only one of them. But because that module is helpful, on a bike we have 2, in a car we have 4, etc. So once you take the module and you start replicating it, that's the regularity piece. But the modularity piece is the encapsulation. So what does that look like in neural tissue or in a network? This right here is a non-modular, fully entangled network. And this right here is a modular network. Information in this module and changing this module will not affect the performance of this module. It's very much like software, right? You can have this separate function here, it's different from this function, and then they're separated out. So why do we care about modularity? Well, the answer is that we think that it's a key to scaling up in complexity and to building complex things. Imagine, for example, trying to build an entire operating system with no functions. Everything in one giant entangled mess. It'd be very difficult to adapt and debug that software. Also, human bodies and in nature, the human brain, we see modules everywhere in nature. So nature also gives us a clue that modularity is the key to reaching complexity. So when we evolve things currently, when we evolve neural networks, we never see modules. Everybody wants it. In fact, there are workshops on how to create it. It's very difficult to create. The only time we do see modularity is if people kind of hand bake it in. They write an encoding that when it makes a mutation operator, it mutates in like a whole separate module and like attaches it. It's not the case that we just kind of mutate in neurons and connections and then because it's a good idea, evolution figures out how to encapsulate these things into separate modules. So for some odd reason, selection alone does not produce modularity unless we bake it in. And out there in the biological literature, this is a fascinating question that biologists are trying to figure out. How did evolution discover to produce modules in bodies and brains? So there's lots of papers in PNAS and Nature and Science trying to figure this out. And the leading hypothesis is very similar to the hypothesis I just told you for why modularity is a good idea. If you have modules, little building blocks, you should be able to rewire them when the environment changes or if you want to build something new to produce some higher level functionality. So the benefits of adaptation should be the reason why you select for modularity. But if that was true, then we would see it in evolutionary algorithms, and we tend not to. So I'm going to show you a completely different hypothesis that's not based on modularity evolving because it helps with adaptation or evolvability. I'm going to say maybe modularity evolves for an entirely different reason. Maybe it evolves just to minimize connection costs. And this is actually a hypothesis that was put out over 100 years ago by a neuroscientist, but no one actually tested it in neuroevolution. So the general idea is that connections are very expensive in your brain. Connection between 2 neurons, you have to build it, you have to maintain it, there's signal drop, and it requires more physical space to put it in. So in any network, wiring it up is expensive. So if there are wiring costs, one solution to that might be modularity. So we're going to test that. And to test that, we're going to use this RetNet problem here. And it basically requires 2 little sub-problems to be solved, and then the information to be put back together. And so imagine if you have this 8-pixel retina, and basically I'm going to ask the algorithm, the evolutionary algorithm, to solve this problem. Is there an object on the left, and is there an object on the right? Now, there's 2 ways to solve this problem. You can either write one function that solves the whole problem, left and right, as a monolithic entangled unit, or I could separately have a submodule that solves left, a submodule that solves right, and then I can bring these 2 information together in an AND gate, right? Now, what Cashton and Allen found is that if you evolve in one environment, you tend to get this. And if you switch between environments that use these subproblems in different combinations, then evolution will pull this stuff out into 2 separate modules. which is exactly what you would expect, what everyone's been hoping for a long time in our field. And they actually found it. So this gave fuel to that hypothesis. So this is a network that was evolved just under this environment. Answer the question, is there a pattern on the left and a pattern on the right? Don't change the environment, just leave it there. If you switch between this environment, Allendar, and this environment, is there a pattern on the left or is there a pattern on the right? Then it separately solves the left and the right, and you put these things together, and you get the answer. And it learns to mutate between this and this very, very quickly. However, once that paper came out in PNAS, everyone kind of thought that there was like a huge amount of improvement in the field. We'd suddenly be able to evolve modules in neural networks all the time. But then when people started to try to actually use this technique, it became very difficult to use it. One reason is because it's not clear how environments change modularly out there in the world. Like if I'm trying to solve Pac-Man, for example, how do I set up a modularly varying version of Pac-Man? It's reusing the same modules in different combinations. You would hope that the game itself requires that, but if you turn out you just try to evolve a neural network for Pac-Man, you're not going to get modules. And that also raises the biological question of how often environments change modularly. It's also been very difficult to replicate these results. So there's been 3 published papers that have tried to implement this, and it didn't work. And so it shows that the result might be very sensitive to very specific parameters of the algorithm, including the frequency of environmental change. So we tested this other hypothesis, connection costs, and here's basically the whole result, the whole paper in one figure. If you take this problem and you evolve for performance alone, so you just select on how well they answer the question, you get entangled non-modular networks. If you select for performance and you select for connection costs, both of those objectives, then you end up with these beautifully separated modules. Now remember, the environment's not changing in this case. Just on a fixed environment, if you have a connection cost, evolution will separate this out. And then we then went on to test whether or not if we put these networks in a new environment, if they will evolve, adapt to the new environment faster, and indeed they do. So let me show you a little bit more of the algorithm. It was a multi-objective algorithm. Basically what that means is that you just have 2 separate objectives or n objectives that you're trying to solve. Cost was based on length, but it also works if you just count up the number of connections. It doesn't have to be a function of their length. And we have this modularity Q-score measure, which allows us to measure the modularity of networks. So if you want to do work in this field, I recommend this metric. All right, here's a lot of data in one slide, but I'll take you through it. The first plot to look at is here. This is modularity over time. Blue is performance alone, just selecting for performance on the question. Green is if you add in a connection cost objective to minimize connection costs. The modularity of the performance alone, this is what we've been doing for 40 years, does not increase over time. It flatlines, and you get these entangled networks. Whereas the modularity, if you add in a connection cost, continues to get better and better over time, even once performance is already perfect. So if you look up here, you can see this is an example of the networks over time. They start out very entangled, and here evolution has produced a network that's modular and perfectly solves the problem, but it's not perfectly modular. Over time, it continues to optimize the modularity to end up with this network here, which is beautifully separated. So another interesting thing to note is here is performance over time. Surprisingly, adding in the extra constraint of a connection cost improved the performance of the algorithm. And the reason is because that connection cost pushed the networks to be more modular, and since the problem is modular, that ended up helping it be in the right area of the search space to produce a final effective neural network. Yeah?
Can you explain the red versus blue color?
Yeah, I'm going to in 1 second. Here are the 2 different the visuals of the 2 different treatments. So all of these are the networks you get, the top performing, most modular networks. If you have no connection cost, just performance, and you can see they're very entangled. And these are the networks you get with a connection cost. And you can see that there are 2 separate modules that are solving the left and the right part of the problem separately, and then bringing it together. So now to answer your question. In addition to this Q-score, which I don't really intuitively know what it means, I just know that it works, I wanted to see if these networks are indeed more modular and if they're functionally modular. So the first thing we did was we asked this Q-score, look at every one of these networks and make the cut that splits it into the 2 best modules you can create. Okay, so we take that cut that the algorithm puts out and we color the nodes on one side orange and the nodes on the other side blue, which is the answer to your question. So here, for example, the network cut here, and you made orange here and blue here. And then what we can ask is, does that division into the two modules of this network, does that map onto the left-right decomposition of the problem? In other words, are all the left inputs in the blue side and the right inputs in the orange side, or vice versa? Or do you have some inputs in one color and some in another? But what we found here is that in 56% of the trials with performance and connection cost, the left part of the problem and the right part of the problem were in separate modules of the network. That never happened without a connection cost in performance alone. We also then wanted to ask, maybe somewhere in here there are modules and you just can't see them, right? Maybe there's like connections with little weights, or they're canceling each other out. Maybe it's just a visualization problem. So what we said is there a neuron somewhere in this population that perfectly answers correctly all of the answers to the left subproblem? And is there another neuron that answers the right subproblem? And then do they put it together? And what we found is that in these networks here, you never find the existence of a neuron that answers the left subproblem or the right subproblem. But in 39% of these trials, you do. For example, this neuron here does answer the right subproblem on its own, and this one answers the left, and then it puts it together. And we can quantify that. So not only is there extra modularity, but it's functional modularity, because identify the subproblems in the task, separately solve them, and then it's put them together. So one of the questions we got from the reviewers is, why does this happen? And so we invented an algorithm that allows you to paint effectively a final best fitness landscape. So for arbitrary dimensions, in this case we did cost versus modularity, we're going to color in the best performance that our algorithm could find for that combination of those dimensions. And this shows you the trade-off between cost and modularity with respect to fitness, which is color. So in this case, yellow is perfect fitness. And what you see is that if you want perfect fitness and you start here, the only way to lower your cost and increase your and keep your fitness high is to increase your modularity. So this right here, these white dots, are where the performance and connection cost treatment ends up. And it's because evolution forces it up this ridge here to this area of the search space. And you can see that over time in this plot. So both performance alone and performance and connection costs start in the same part of the space. And over time, performance alone kind of stays there. There's no force that's pushing it down in cost. But this pressure here, which forces you down in cost, combined with the fact that you also have to perform well, pushes you right up this front that we see in this map here, such that most of your networks end up in this part of the space. And then the question is, does that help you with evolvability, which is what everybody wants. We want our algorithms to do better. And so to figure that out, we kept evolving the separate treatments until we had 50 perfectly performing networks in one environment. So I had 50 performance alone networks that are perfect, they solve the problem perfectly, 50 performance and connection cost networks that solve it perfectly, and then I'm going to take them from the environment they evolved in, I'm going to put them in this new environment and see how fast do they adapt. And then I can do the same for the opposite order. And what we found is that this is the number of generations until they adapt to the new environment. That with a connection cost, the modular networks adapt very quickly. In fact, almost in 1 or 2 generations to the new environment. Without a connection cost, these entangled networks take much longer to evolve to the new environment. The next question is, how does this compare to the leading hypothesis? The one where you change environments and evolution automatically separates out, which was the paper in PNAS. And so to compare that, we took our result here, which is performance and connection cost, and we put it in a changing environment. And we also put performance alone in a changing environment, and then we looked at the results in modularity. And then we swept across the frequency of changing the environment. And what you find here is that the performance alone in a changing environment can produce high modularity if the frequency is just right. But if the environment is changing too slow or too fast, that result kind of falls apart. So it's kind of a fragile result. Whereas with the connection cost, you get a high amount of modularity irrespective of the rate at which you change the environment. And even if you don't change the environment at all. So if you want a fixed environment, you want modularity, you should use a connection cost. What's interesting, though, is that this right here is the level of modularity we saw without changing the environment at all. If you change the environment, you do see a lift in modularity. So the two hypotheses are kind of synergistic. They both probably explain some of the modularity in nature. In this case, most of the modularity, though, came from the connection cost. Okay, we wanted to cross all the T's and dot all the I's, so we tried it on a non-modular problem. And basically what you see is no performance difference, because the problem doesn't benefit if there's no modularity to it. But you still see this modularity difference. Now what's interesting about that is that you can get the modularity without a performance hit, even on a non-modular problem. But my conjecture is that almost no interesting problems out there in the world are non-modular. Every challenging problem can be decomposed and divided, which is why you almost always write functions unless you're doing a very simple programming task. We also tried it on multiple separate problems, so these are 5 completely independent problems. The information that helps you solve this network here absolutely does not help you solve this problem. And what you find is that performance alone, which is the typical way to do it, still combined information across problems. It couldn't separate these things out, which goes to show you that when you evolve neural networks, it tends to be very hard to eliminate connections even when the problems are completely decomposable, because the selection is not perfect. Whereas with the connection cost, you get the perfect decomposition into 5 separate modules. And the same thing happens on a harder, more hierarchical, more complicated problem. So the implications of this work for you guys and for the neuroevolution community is adding a cost increases performance, modularity, and evolvability. And importantly, it's also simple to implement. You can just put a connection cost into your algorithm and you will start to get these modules, and it should start to help you with performance and evolvability, meaning that it should be a powerful neuroevolution technique. Now obviously we've only tried it on the problems I've showed you here, so we need to try it on more problems and more complicated problems, and hopefully some of you maybe can test it out. But so far, it looks pretty powerful. Biologically speaking, we also we think we've uncovered a major explanatory force for the evolution of modularity, which will help biologists, evolutionary biologists, try to explain and understand why so many networks in the world are modular. Because everything from protein-protein interaction networks to metabolic networks to genetic regulatory networks to neural networks are modular, and we don't have a good explanation for why. And we think this could be one of the forces that causes it to happen. And very interestingly, it's probably the only force that can get you there in the first place. All of this hypothesis for why modularity should work say, well, if I'm modular, then I get a selective advantage. But that only works once I'm modular. How do I get to modularity in the first place? Something like this that's independent of the adaptability benefit can bootstrap those other hypotheses by pushing you towards modularity, at which point maybe then selection, because of the evolvability, picks it up and runs with it. So I have a couple of slides of conclusions. The first thing is I hope that I've shown you guys a more comprehensive picture of generative encodings, and that we've done that by sweeping problems across a continuum of regularity. And we basically found that generative encodings can indeed exploit intermediate amounts of regularity in order to perform better. So this picture ends up being more correct than this picture. It is the case that it can exploit intermediate amounts of regularity. And it does so by producing regular brains that have regular behaviors, coordinated gaits, for example. I've also showed you, however, that a bias towards regularity can be too strong. It can hurt if you don't also have another process that can exploit the irregularity of the problem. And I think a learning algorithm, and combined with an evolutionary algorithm, a generative encoding, is the way to go there. And finally, I've shown you that there's a simple and powerful technique to increase modularity in your networks. It can also get you evolvability and higher performance. So the overall conclusions, I think, is that we have a long way to go, obviously, to get to jaguars and hawks and humans, but that we've made a tremendous amount of progress in recent years on some of the key properties that I think will get our algorithms going in that direction. And those are regularity and modularity. And up next is we probably have to tackle things like hierarchy in the brain, scaling to networks that are millions of connections or billions of connections so that we can have a computational power of natural brains. And those, these properties here and combining them with these properties should hopefully help us to get to neural networks that eventually start to rival their natural counterparts. With that, I'll say thanks and take questions.